Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today, as you might have noticed, we're not in the kitchen, but we're here in my studio instead, because we're doing something a little bit different than what we normally do, and kicking off a brand new series that's dedicated to the fundamentals of wok cooking. More specifically, we'll be starting off with maybe the single most requested video in the history of this channel, which is a quick guide to pantry essentials. As most folks that have attempted pretty much any Woo Can Cook recipe will tell you, there are certainly quite a large number of pantry sauces and ingredients that come up in our ingredient lists, and I know that this can be a little bit intimidating for those just starting to dip their toes into wok cooking. Not only can this be cost prohibitive if you don't have any of these sauces in your pantry yet, but more importantly, if you don't actually know what you're going to be using them for in the future, it's hard to justify buying all of these things for just one meal. So for our purposes today, we're going to be specifically focusing on Chinese wok cooking and taking a look at what do all of these sauces and ingredients do. Why are there so many of them in a single recipe, and what purpose do they actually serve? Finally, most importantly, is it really necessary to include all of these ingredients, or can we start omitting stuff if needed, and if so, when? Lastly, before we dive in, a quick disclaimer that I am by no means a culinary master, but I have done a lot of wok cooking and have also spent a lifetime watching my parents and grandparents do it too. The best that I can offer here is what I know from personal experience and how I've come to approach wok cooking. It is certainly not the only way or even the most traditional way, but hopefully it can help you at the very least avoid some of the mistakes that I've made, because I've made a lot of them. Okay, so let's get into it.
You want me, I want you, baby. My sugar boo, I'm levitating. Don't look away. I got you, moonlight. You're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance.
Alright, so kicking things off, I'm starting off here with the ingredients that you'll likely see come up in pretty much every Woo Can Cook recipe. This is because they're the elements that we use as the fundamental baseline for our umami. You can think of these as the sort of foundational cinder blocks that we lay at our groundwork as we start building out qualities and layers of umami. That's what cinder blocks do, right? Anyway, what I have here is my soy sauce, my toasted sesame oil, and chicken bouillon powder. In the realm of things that we don't want to skip, these are definitely gonna be the big ones. For our soy sauce, you'll often see me starting sauces and marinades with this element and then stacking things on top. Generally, when I'm cooking, I like to use low sodium or green cap soy sauce because the lower salt content allows us to be a little bit more aggressive with how much we use. If you're using full sodium or red cap soy sauce, you want to half the quantity that you see in pretty much any Woo Can Cook recipe. For our sesame oil, you'll want to find the toasted stuff because it's going to be a little bit more aromatic and fragrant. It can be very overpowering though, so you generally won't see me using more than a tablespoon or two of this stuff, unless we're doing something where I want to punch you in the goddamn face with sesame, like our honey sesame chicken recipe. Lastly is our chicken bouillon powder. Now this is something that I buy in large quantities and then just keep in the back of my pantry at all times. I think it's something like a teaspoon of this stuff will render an entire cup of stock, so this 35-ounce tin will last a while. You'll often see me using stock to loosen up sauce bases that don't quite have enough liquid going on in them otherwise. If you're vegetarian, you can absolutely swap this out for veggie stock, or if you're in a pinch, you can also just use plain old water too. Then finally, as a bonus, if you want to go the extra mile, you can also make your own stocks and then freeze it until you need it. I personally like to do this with a cool food waste hack by throwing my veggie scraps and bones at the end of every cook into a freezer bag and then throwing that into the freezer. Then once I have a whole bag full of scraps, I'll throw that into a stock pot and boil it with some water for 6 to 8 hours into what you can literally refer to as garbage water. Then we strain the scraps, skim off the impurities, and you've got yourself some liquid gold. Next up, we're taking a look at some cooking oils, which is another very commonly asked question during our live streams. I actually don't have a huge preference surrounding the flavor of cooking oils, so I don't get too picky about this stuff. The main detail that we want to address here is that since wok cooking happens at extremely high heat, we want to make sure that the oil that we're using also has a very high smoke point, which is exactly as it sounds, oil that starts smoking at high heat. Now, for what it's worth, not all smoking oil is bad. You'll notice that even a high smoke point oil will produce smoke eventually. However, the fats in oils with a lower smoke point, like olive oil or butter, will start to burn at high heats, which leads to a burnt flavor in your food. To address this in wok cooking, we use any kind of oil that won't start burning at high heat. For those who are just starting out, especially since it can be expensive, it may also be very useful to pick a neutral flavored oil for this purpose so that you can use it in other scenarios that are not wok cooking. My personal favorite is grapeseed oil, not only because it's affordable, but also because it's neutral to my tastes. You can also use canola or vegetable oil as well though, which are both relatively neutral too. Then finally, for your bonus points, the golden standard of cooking oil in wok cooking is generally going to be peanut oil, because it has an aromatic quality that pairs really well with a lot of stir fries. There are a few downsides to peanut oil though. The first is that it is a tad bit more expensive and has more calories than most vegetable oils. But also maybe more importantly, it is very fragrant and aromatic. This makes it great for your wok fries like kung pao chicken or mapo tofu where that aromatic quality is appropriate. But the next morning when you wake up for breakfast and you want to make your hash browns, that aromatic quality isn't going to play quite as nicely anymore unless you want peanut flavored hash browns. So if you keep peanut oil on hand for your wok fries, you'll also need to keep some other vegetable or canola oil on hand as well for everything else. Alright, so getting into our dry pantry goods next, I'm starting off with maybe the single most important ingredient in all of Chinese cooking, which is our cornstarch. Cornstarch has a few different uses in wok cooking, both as a thickening agent, a breading agent, and a marinade ingredient. For thickening purposes, you will often see me refer to a cornstarch slurry in many of our sauce-based recipes, which is exactly as it sounds, a slurry of cornstarch mixed with water. The amount of water is not super important because our main goal here is to break down that cornstarch into a liquid form. This allows us to add our cornstarch to wok fries at the very end to tighten up our sauce bases without running the risk of letting that cornstarch clump up, and yes, I have done that on many occasions. You'll also see cornstarch come up in deep fries as a really light breading agent, like in our Hong Sao Tofu recipe. Then finally, you might also see me using cornstarch in our meat marinades and whisked eggs as a way to slow down the exterior cook time of our proteins. Essentially what's happening is that in a wok fry, the extremely high heat of the wok can overcook the exterior of our proteins quicker than we want, even before we finish cooking the interior. To combat this, we often will add a pinch of cornstarch to slow down the exterior of our cook, resulting in a nice tender piece of chicken or ground beef or ground pork or eggs. Moving on to our sugar, this is some light brown sugar that I have in my pantry. Quick food science fact, brown sugar is just white sugar that has been cooked in molasses, which gives it its color. Generally, if you see me adding sugar to a recipe, it's gonna be brown sugar because I personally find that the extra molasses gives it a little bit of a more deeper and richer quality than plain white sugar. If you're in a pinch, you can absolutely just use plain old white sugar though. Rounding things out, here is my kosher salt and white pepper. The kosher salt is here for the same reason that we use it in European cooking. We use kosher salt as opposed to plain table salt during our cooking process because the larger grains of that salt will allow us to hold more of the salt in our fingers in each pinch to prevent over-salting. In a pinch, no pun intended, you can also use plain table salt in smaller quantities, but you'll need to be a little bit more careful though. Then our white pepper is also very useful in meat marinades because the finer quality incorporates into the meat a little bit better than cracked pepper. It's also very fragrant and aromatic and is also pretty commonly eaten with soup, so you might recognize this as the stuff on the Lazy Susan in Chinese restaurants next to the soy sauce. Again, in a pinch though, you can also substitute this with some plain black pepper. Lastly, for our bonus ingredients, this is a bit of baking soda and MSG. I included this baking soda here mostly because I figured it's a common one for folks to already have on hand already. I like to add this to steak marinades like in our broccoli beef and Mongolian beef recipes. I dove into the food science behind this in our broccoli beef recipe already, so you can head over there if you want to learn more. But baking soda is used in a process called velveting to create a super tender piece of beef from an otherwise relatively tough cut of steak like flank steak, which is fairly commonly used in Chinese food. Then finally is our MSG, which I personally very rarely use, but if for whatever reason what you're cooking is falling flat, you can add a small pinch of this stuff and it will brighten things up for you. I personally tend not to use MSG as an independent ingredient, mostly because the sauces that we're using already contain quite a bit of MSG, but it is a useful one to keep around in case you happen to have omitted something. Next up, we're getting to the good stuff, which is our pantry sauces, which I know is the bit that you're all here for. This is also by far the most subjective part of my pantry, so I will reiterate, I'm just speaking from my own personal experiences here. I have this separated into 4 separate categories, which I'm calling my acids, my sweet umami, heat umami, and my intense umami. For our acids, what I have here is my rice vinegar and Shaoxing wine. Both of these serve the same purpose, which is to add a little bit of brightness to a recipe. This is really important in stir fries that are otherwise heavy in salt because it helps balance out our flavor palette really nicely. Rice vinegar is likely the most common one for folks to have on hand already, but in a pinch you might also sub this with some plain white vinegar too. Then next is our Shaoxing wine, or more colloquially, Chinese cooking wine. It is a similarly common cooking alcohol to add for a bit of brightness and sweetness to a dish as well. It is essentially dry cooking sherry, which is likely a bit more common here in the States. So if you've got that on hand already, you can absolutely just opt for that stuff instead. And in fact, if you have a high quality cooking sherry, this might be even better since high quality Shaoxing wine is pretty tough to locate here in the States. For reference, this is a $2 bottle of Shaoxing wine, and on the back it specifically says that it's meant for cooking and not for drinking, which is scary. Why did they have to specify this? Then finally, for our bonus ingredient, this is some black vinegar, which is similar to our rice vinegar, but with a little bit more malted sweetness and complex aromatic quality. You will see me using this one in a lot of recipes where we're trying to recreate a darker caramel tint to our dishes, like our pad ki mao. In a pinch, you can swap this out for some rice vinegar plus some brown sugar, but again, it's a fun bonus ingredient to have on hand in your pantry. Moving on to our sweet umami elements, which, as the category implies, are the elements that we use to create umami that have a slightly sweet or oftentimes aggressively sweet quality. As with our acids, I wouldn't necessarily say that these are interchangeable, but as you browse through a recipe, you can think of these all as sort of serving the same purpose. What I have here is my hoisin sauce, my oyster sauce, and my fish sauce. Now, lots of folks mistakenly equate hoisin sauce and oyster sauce because they look similar, but they are genuinely wildly different ingredients. I've personally always thought of hoisin sauce as the sort of ketchup of Chinese food. It has an aggressively sweet quality to it, and I find myself using it quite a bit when reproducing Panda Express recipes to capture that Americanized Chinese food vibe. Oyster sauce, while it might look similar, is, as the name implies, derived from the fermentation of oyster and gives us a deep, rich umami quality with a very slight sweetness to it coming from its fermentation. In a pinch, you might swap this out for some fish sauce, which is more commonly found in Southeast Asian cuisine, since they're both providing a sweeter fishy umami quality, but keep in mind that that darker caramel quality of the oyster sauce is a pretty iconic part of a lot of Chinese stir-fries, like our lion's head meatball recipe. For our bonus ingredient, I have some sweet chili sauce here, which I find myself using in a lot of our amped up fried chicken recipes, like our sweet and sour chicken, to reproduce that sweet Americanized Chinese food quality with a slightly more complex form of heat, though. Again, like our white pepper, you might recognize this from the Lazy Susan next to the soy sauce in a lot of Chinese restaurants as well, since it's commonly used as a dipping sauce with egg rolls and lumpia. Next up, getting to the good stuff now, we're looking at the big three ingredients that you'll most often see me using to create heat in a recipe. This is our doubanjiang, or fermented chili paste, our laoganma, or chili crisp oil, and our sambal olek, or chili sauce. All three of these, as the name implies, are derived from the fermentation of chili, with the doubanjiang being the most aggressive of the three. This stuff is punch you in the face aggressive, so again, I'll reiterate, use this sparingly. Oftentimes, you might also see me using this in conjunction with our laoganma chili crisp oil, which is a much more subtle form of heat with an interesting pervasive quality due to its oily nature. As a side note, the term laoganma is actually referring to the manufacturer that makes this sauce, literally translating to old grandma, hence the old lady on the label, although it is colloquially often used to refer to their flagship spicy chili crisp oil. You will also see a wide array of other sauces that they make too, which I highly encourage that you try out, and in fact, their chili crisp oil with black beans is a critical ingredient in our mapo tofu recipe. Then for our bonus ingredient, this is some sambal olek, which is technically a Southeast Asian ingredient, but also very commonly found in Chinese food. Like our doubanjiang, it is also a very aggressive form of heat, so again, use this stuff sparingly. You might often see me adding this stuff to dipping sauces with a bit of soy sauce for a bit of heat. Last up here is our intense umami elements, which I've named this way because they are very concentrated and should always be used very sparingly. I'll reiterate here, because these sauces are so concentrated, these are the ones that are easiest to overdo in a recipe and can very easily be the way that you ruin an entire dish if you're too heavy-handed with them. First up here are my dark soy sauce and black bean paste. For our dark soy sauce, you will often see me using this in conjunction with oyster sauce and black vinegar to create that deep, rich, and caramel color that you'll often recognize from things like Lionhead's meatball, pad ki mao, broccoli beef, and many others. As the name implies, this sauce is very dark and a little bit more syrupy than your standard soy sauce, so don't try and use these two interchangeably. As a side note, it also has an equivalent ingredient in Southeast Asian food called kicap manis, or Indonesian sweet soy sauce, which is commonly used in dishes like pad ki mao and pad see ew. Here in Oakland, Chinatown, where Southeast Asian ingredients are a little bit harder for me to locate, you might often see me using dark soy sauce in place of kicap manis since they're pretty close substitutions. Next up is our black bean paste, which, as the name implies, comes from the fermentation of black bean. You'll recognize this element from a bunch of Wu Can Cook recipes. I know I slipped it into a General Tso's chicken recipe once a while back. But most iconically, this sauce is used in a Chinese noodle dish called dajiaomian for a super rich and salty umami. I also love sneaking this into recipes in unexpected places for a nice kick in the pants though. As with many of our other sauces, it is very concentrated, so use this one sparingly. Finally, for our bonus ingredient, this is some gochujang paste, which is a Korean chili paste, sort of the cultural equivalent of the Chinese doubanjiang. While it is similarly aggressively spicy, it also has a sweeter quality to it due to its fermentation process. I wouldn't necessarily say that these two are interchangeable, but in a pinch, I have often swapped them out for each other. Alright, so rounding things out here, mainly just because it felt kind of weird doing a whole video without actually cooking anything, I thought I'd throw together my favorite quick pantry snack, which has always been way too simple to be a formal recipe. So what we're doing here is my favorite way of eating cold tofu that my mom used to throw together at 3 p.m. on a Saturday anytime we complained about being hungry. This is a block of silken or soft tofu that I'm draining of its water, then slicing into cubes and adding to a bowl. Then I'm topping this with a little bit of soy sauce to start, followed by some toasted sesame oil and dried furikake. This one takes about 2 minutes to make. It's super filling since it's protein heavy. The furikake adds a nice bit of texture and crunch to the tofu, and it's honestly one of my top 5 ways of eating soft tofu. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that this was helpful and informative, or at the very least entertaining to watch. If this was your first time catching a Wu Can Cook video, as you might have guessed by now, normally we cook things on this channel, so definitely check out a recipe video next, because there are a lot of those. I know that there are a lot of things that we didn't get to in this video, especially the stuff that doesn't come up in Chinese cooking. So if there's something that I left out that you want me to talk about, feel free and drop that in the comments, and I'll make sure to touch on it in the next video. Lastly, for the Bay Area locals, the Wu Can Cook fried rice pop-up is back at the Alameda Antiques Fair this coming Sunday, so swing by and come say hi if you can. More about that at wucancook.com/eats. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, be nice people, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
I got you.